In the spring of 742, in one of the Frankish castles, a boy was born who was destined to change the fate of Europe. The exact birthplace of the future emperor remains a subject of debate among historians, with castles in Ingelheim near Mainz, Karlheim near Munich, as well as Aachen and Salzburg being cited. The infant was named Charles in honor of his paternal grandfather, the legendary Charles Martel. The newborn's father, Pepin, bore the nickname the Short due to his height. He held the office of mayor of the palace, effectively acting as the ruler of the Frankish state under the nominally reigning Merovingian king. Charles's mother, Bertrada, was the daughter of Count Caribert of Leon. Their marriage union remained unofficial for a long time and was only officially recognized by the church in 749, when their eldest son was already 7 years old. Charles's grandfather, Charles Martel, became famous for his victory over the Arabs at Poitiers in 732, halting their advance into Europe. This man laid the foundations for the power of the dynasty that would later be called Carolingian, named after its greatest representative. Charles's family belonged to the highest Frankish aristocracy and controlled vast territories within the kingdom. The future emperor's childhood passed in an atmosphere of political intrigue and constant struggle for power. The Frankish state was undergoing a period of transformation, where real power had long since passed from the Merovingian kings to the mayors of the palace. Pepin the Short did not intend to be satisfied with the role of the second person in the state. He carefully prepared the ground for the final seizure of the royal title, enlisting the support of the church and the Frankish nobility. In 751, when Charles was 9 years old, an event occurred that forever changed his family's position. Pepin the Short carried out a coup d'état, deposing the last Merovingian king, Childeric III. With the blessing of Pope Zacharias, Pepin was proclaimed King of the Franks, becoming the founder of a new royal dynasty. Young Charles witnessed his father transform from a mayor of the palace into a full-fledged monarch. The ceremony of Pepin's coronation was conducted with unprecedented splendor. The Pope personally consecrated the power of the new dynasty, which gave it legitimacy in the eyes of the Christian world. For little Charles, this became an essential lesson. He saw the power inherent in the alliance between secular authority and the church. This lesson he would remember for the rest of his life and would apply in his own politics. Charles's education began early, although it differed significantly from what young aristocrats received in later eras. The Frankish nobility of the 8th century did not particularly value bookish learning, preferring military arts and practical management skills. Charles learned horse riding, weaponry, hunting, and everything a warrior and future ruler should know. At the same time, he received some intellectual education, including the basics of Latin and familiarity with Christian doctrine. Charles's youth was spent in constant military campaigns alongside his father. Pepin the Short pursued an active foreign policy, expanding the borders of the Frankish kingdom and strengthening his power. He fought the Saxons in the east, the Aquitanians in the south, and the Lombards in Italy. Young Charles accompanied his father on these expeditions, gaining invaluable military experience and learning the art of command. Pepin was a demanding father and teacher. He raised his son with strictness, preparing him for the heavy role of ruler of a large state. Charles inherited many qualities from his father: firmness of character, decisiveness in decision-making, and the ability to command both respect and fear from subordinates. He learned that power requires not only force but also cunning, not only courage, but also calculation. Charles had a younger brother, Charlemagne, born in 751. The relationship between the brothers was difficult from childhood. Pepin the Short, following Frankish tradition, planned to divide the kingdom between his 2 sons after his death. This meant that the brothers would either have to learn to cooperate or enter into a struggle against each other. Time would show which path they would choose. The years of his youth tempered Charles's character, making him strong, resilient, and capable of enduring the hardships of military life. He grew into a tall and physically strong man, which was a rarity in his lineage. Contemporaries noted his impressive appearance, a booming voice and a piercing gaze. Even in his youth, Charles made the impression of a natural leader, a man created for power and great achievement. On September 24, 768, King Pepin the Short died at the monastery of Saint-Denis near Paris. He was only 54 years old, but years of continuous wars and the labors of state administration had undermined his health. Death overtook him while he was preparing for another military campaign. The Frankish nobility and church hierarchy gathered to decide the question of succession. According to Pepin's will and Frankish tradition, the kingdom was divided between his two sons. Charles, who had turned 26, received the northern and western regions, including Neustria, most of Austrasia, and western Aquitaine. Charlemagne, the younger brother, inherited the southern and eastern lands, including Burgundy, Provence, Septimania, Alsace, and eastern Austrasia. The division proved to be uneven and geographically inconvenient, which created the groundwork for future conflict. The coronation ceremony for the two brothers took place in different cities, which in itself was a significant event. Charles was crowned in Noyon on October 9, 768, and Charlemagne received the crown in the Cathedral of Soissons. The Frankish nobility divided in their sympathy. Some supported the elder brother, while others preferred the younger. The brothers' mother, Bertrada, tried to maintain peace between them, but her efforts did not bring lasting results. From the first days of their joint rule, serious contradictions arose between the brothers. Their possessions were intermingled in such a way that border disputes and conflicts of interest were constant. When an uprising against Frankish rule flared up in Aquitaine, Charles turned to his brother for military aid. Charlemagne refused, which was perceived as an open display of hostility. Charles had to suppress the rebellion with his own forces, which he did with ruthless determination. The policy of their mother, Queen Bertrada, aimed at reconciliation, included dynastic marriages. She persuaded Charles to marry the daughter of the Lombard king, Desiderius, hoping to create an alliance with a powerful neighbor. This marriage was concluded around 770 but lasted only a short time. Charles, for reasons that remained unclear to contemporaries, sent the Lombard princess back to her father a year later. This decision deeply offended King Desiderius and created tension in the relationship between the Franks and the Lombards. The internal political situation in both parts of the Frankish kingdom remained unstable. The local nobility used the contradictions between the brothers for their own interests, maneuvering between the two courts. Bishops and abbots, who controlled significant land holdings, also adopted a wait-and-see attitude. Everyone understood that such a state of affairs could not last forever. Sooner or later, the kingdom had to be united under the rule of one leader. In the winter of 771, Charlemagne's health sharply deteriorated. He suffered from an illness, the nature of which remained unknown. On December 4, 771, Charlemagne died at the age of just 20 inches his residence at Samocy near Laon. The death was sudden and gave rise to many rumors. Some contemporaries suspected that Charles might have been involved in his brother's demise, but no direct evidence was ever presented. The late Charlemagne left behind young sons who could theoretically claim the inheritance of their father's land. However, Charles acted quickly and decisively. He immediately headed to his brother's lands at the head of an army, leaving the Frankish nobility no time for reflection. The most important vassals and church hierarchs supported Charles, recognizing him as the sole legitimate king of all the Franks. Charlemagne's widow and children were forced to flee to Italy, where they found refuge at the court of the Lombard king, Desiderius. The unification of the kingdom happened surprisingly easily and without bloodshed. This testified to the fact that the Frankish elite was tired of internal strife and was looking for a strong ruler capable of ensuring stability and order. Charles, at the age of 29, became the sole ruler of all Frankish lands, one of the largest states in Europe at that time. Limitless possibilities for realizing ambitious plans opened up before him, Charles's new status as the only king of the Franks required him to demonstrate strength and the ability to protect his land. The borders of the kingdom were vast but not always reliably protected. To the east were the pagan Saxons, who carried out regular raids on Frankish territory. To the south, beyond the Pyrenees, were the Moorish emirates that controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. In Italy, the Lombard king Desiderius, offended by Charles's previous actions, represented a potential threat. Charles understood that to strengthen his power, he needed to conduct an active foreign policy. Successful military campaigns would not only expand the kingdom's borders and bring rich spoils, but also strengthen the king's authority among the Frankish nobility. The warlike aristocracy was accustomed to constant wars. They were a source of their prosperity and glory. A king who could lead his people from victory to victory could count on their loyalty. The first years of Charles's sole rule were devoted to strengthening internal order and preparing for large-scale military undertaking. He toured his lands, accepted oaths of allegiance from local nobility, and appointed his own people to key positions. The royal court constantly moved from one residence to another. Charles did not have a permanent capital, governing the state in motion. This practice was typical for early medieval monarchs, whose power was based on personal presence and direct control. In the spring of 773, a political crisis erupted in Rome that gave Charles a pretext for intervening in Italian affairs. The Lombard king Desiderius, having provided shelter to Charlemagne's widow and children, began to put pressure on Pope Hadrian I. Desiderius demanded that the Pope crown Charlemagne's sons as kings of the Franks, which threatened Charles's position. The Pope refused to fulfill this demand and appealed to the Frankish king for help. Charles immediately reacted to the Pope's call. For him, this was an ideal casus belli, allowing him to intervene in Italian affairs under the noble pretext of protecting the head of the Christian Church. Furthermore, the conquest of the rich Lombard kingdom promised enormous booty and the strengthening of the international prestige of the Frankish state. In the summer of 773, Charles gathered a huge army and moved toward the Alps. The crossing of the Alps was a complex military undertaking. The Lombards had fortified the main mountain passes, hoping to stop the Frankish invasion. However, Charles demonstrated outstanding strategic talent by dividing his army into two parts. The main forces under his personal command were to attack the main pass, while a second detachment under the command of his uncle, Bernard, sought bypass routes through less guarded mountain paths. The maneuver succeeded brilliantly. When the Lombards focused all their forces on defending the main pass, Bernard's detachment suddenly appeared in their rear. The Lombard army was forced to retreat without accepting battle. The path to the Po River Valley was open to the Frankish armies. Desiderius withdrew his troops to the capital of the kingdom, the city of Pavia, preparing for a long siege. The siege of Pavia began in the autumn of 773 and dragged on for many months. The city was heavily fortified, had large reserves of food, and a reliable garrison. Charles could not take it by assault and was forced to wait for hunger to compel the defenders to surrender. Meanwhile, the Frankish king did not waste time. He sent part of his forces to capture other Lombard cities, gradually subjecting the entire kingdom to his power. In the spring of 774, leaving part of his army to continue the siege of Pavia, Charles set off for Rome. He arrived in the Eternal City on Easter and was solemnly met by Pope Hadrian. The meeting of the two rulers, secular and spiritual, had enormous symbolic significance. The Pope needed the protection of the Frankish king, and Charles wanted to receive the Church's blessing for his conquests. Charles confirmed the so-called donation of Pepin, according to which Frankish kings guaranteed the Pope ownership of vast territories in central Italy. This laid the foundation for the secular power of the Roman popes, which would last for more than 1,000 years. For Charles, the alliance with the papacy was strategically important. It legitimized his power and provided a moral justification for wars against pagans and heretics. After returning from Rome, Charles continued the siege of Pavia. By the beginning of the summer of 774, the situation of the city's defenders became critical. Food had run out, an epidemic started among the townspeople. The morale of the army was broken. In June, King Desiderius admitted his defeat and opened the gates of Pavia. He was captured along with his family and sent to the Frankish kingdom, where he ended his days in a monastery. Charles did not appoint a new Lombard king but took the crown himself, proclaiming himself king of the Franks and Lombards. This was an unprecedented step, meaning not just a conquest, but the complete incorporation of the Lombard kingdom into the Frankish state. The Lombard nobility was forced to swear an oath of allegiance to the new king, although many did so reluctantly and under the pressure of circumstances. The conquest of Italy significantly increased the territory and power of the Frankish state. Charles now controlled the wealthiest regions of Europe, including ancient Roman cities with their developed economy and culture. The Lombard kingdom possessed significant material resources. Its treasury replenished the Frankish one. Moreover, control over northern Italy gave Charles the ability to influence the politics of the papacy and the entire Christian world. However, the success of the Italian campaign had a downside. The conquest created new problems of governing remote territories with a different culture and tradition. The Lombards, although Christians, differed significantly from the Franks in language, customs, and legal system. Charles had to find a way to integrate them into his state without causing constant uprising. This task would require not only military force but also administrative talent. The victory over the Lombards brought Charles immense prestige among the Frankish nobility and in the eyes of the entire Christian world. The young king proved that he was worthy of his grandfather, Charles Martel, and capable of great achievements. However, even more serious tests awaited him ahead. In the east, beyond the Rhine, lived the warlike Saxons pagans who had terrorized Frankish borders for centuries. The subjugation of the Saxons would become the main life's work of Charlemagne, a war that would last for more than 30 years. The Saxons were a Germanic people inhabiting vast territories between the Rhine and Elbe rivers, from the North Sea to the central German upland. They remained pagans, worshipping ancient Germanic gods and rejecting Christianity. Saxon society was organized tribally, lacking a single king or central authority. This decentralization made the Saxons difficult opponents. It was impossible to defeat them by defeating one ruler or taking a capital city. The first major campaign of Charles against the Saxons took place in 772, even before the Italian expedition. The Frankish army invaded Saxony and destroyed the pagan sanctuary of Irminsul, the sacred pillar that the Saxons worshipped as a symbol of the world tree. This was not just a military action, but an ideological blow intended to break the spirit of Saxon resistance. Charles seized significant spoils and forced the Saxons to take an oath of allegiance. But as soon as the Frankish army left, the Saxons rebelled again. After returning from Italy in 775, Charles again turned his attention to the Saxon problem. He conducted another campaign beyond the Rhine, this time advancing deeper into Saxon lands. The Franks captured many prisoners, imposed tribute on the Saxons, and demanded the adoption of Christianity. A fortified camp was built at Eresburg, where a Frankish garrison was stationed. Charles intended to create a system of fortifications for permanent control over Saxony. In the summer of 776, Charles convened a large assembly in Paderborn on territory just captured from the Saxons. This was a demonstrative gesture intended to show that Frankish power was established there firmly and for a long time. Saxon chieftains arrived at the assembly to swear an oath of allegiance. Many of them agreed to be baptized, seeing this as a way to ensure peace with their powerful neighbor. However, this submission was superficial and temporary. In the autumn of 778, while Charles was busy preparing a campaign in Spain against the Moors, the Saxons launched a major uprising. They attacked Frankish garrisons, destroyed the fortifications that had been built, razed Christian churches, and killed missionaries. A wave of pagan reaction swept across all of Saxony. At the head of the uprising stood a man whose name would become a symbol of Saxon resistance, a chieftain named Widukind. Widukind came from a noble Saxon family and enjoyed enormous authority among his people. He was a talented military leader who knew how to organize guerrilla warfare against the Franks. Widukind understood that the Saxons could not defeat the Franks in open battle, so he chose the tactics of surprise raids, ambushes, and rapid retreat. When Frankish troops appeared in Saxony, he would cross behind the Elbe to the territory of the Danes, where he found refuge. The uprising of 778 caught Charles by surprise. He was forced to delay his Spanish expedition and return to the Saxon border. The Frankish army again invaded Saxony, suppressing resistance with ruthless cruelty. The villages of the rebels were burned to the ground, captives were enslaved, and the leaders of the uprising were executed. However, Widukind managed to avoid capture, and as long as he was alive, the Saxons' hope for liberation did not die. Charles realized that simple military presence was insufficient for the subjugation of the Saxon. It was necessary to change the very structure of Saxon society, destroy the foundations of their pagan culture, and replace it with Christian one. In 780, he issued the so-called First Saxon Capitulary, a code of laws of extreme cruelty. According to this document, the death penalty awaited anyone for any manifestation of paganism, for refusing baptism, or for attacking a church or a priest. The capitulary prescribed the forced baptism of all Saxons, the construction of churches in every district, and the appointment of Frankish priests to preach Christianity. The Saxons were required to pay tithes to the church, which was a heavy burden for a society accustomed to different forms of organization. Any attempt to return to pagan customs was punishable by death. This was a systematic plan of cultural genocide aimed at the complete destruction of Saxon pagan identity. Charles's repressive policy caused the opposite effect. Instead of submission, it generated even more bitter resistance. For the Saxons, this was no longer just a war for independence, but a fight for the survival of their culture and faith. Every executed pagan became a martyr. Every burned village gave birth to new enemies of the Franks. The war acquired the character of a religious conflict where compromise became impossible. In 782, an event occurred that showed the full depth of Saxon hatred for Frankish rule. A large Saxon army, led by Widukind, carried out a daring raid across the Rhine and devastated Frankish lands as far as the Moselle River. This was a blow to Charles's prestige, a demonstration that the Saxon problem was far from solved. The king was furious and vowed to punish the rebels severely. In the autumn of the same year, Charles personally led a punitive expedition into Saxony. The Frankish army passed with fire and sword through the lands of the rebellious tribes. Everywhere, the Franks demanded the surrender of the ringleaders of the uprising. Many Saxon chieftains, frightened by the scale of the repressions, agreed to cooperate with the conquerors. They handed over 4,500 Saxons to Charles, who were accused of participating in the uprising. What happened next went down in history as one of the bloodiest atrocities of the early Middle Ages. On the banks of the river Weser, near the town of Verden, all 4,500 captive Saxons were beheaded in one day by Charles's order. The mass execution was intended to intimidate the Saxons and break their will to resist. Charles wanted to show that the price of rebellion was unacceptably high, that further resistance would lead only to the destruction of the Saxon people. The Verden massacre of 782 did not break Saxon resistance, but it changed its character. Mass executions caused a wave of horror not only among the Saxons but also among the Franks themselves. Even church hierarchs, who usually supported the policy of Christianization, were shocked by the scale of the bloodshed. Charles's advisor, the scholar Alcuin, later cautiously criticized the cruel methods of converting pagans to Christianity, pointing out that faith should be voluntary, not forced. Widukind continued to lead the resistance, although his position became more difficult. Many Saxon chieftains, frightened by the prospect of new repressions, began to seek compromise with the Franks. Saxon society split between those who were ready to accept Christianity and Frankish rule, and those who continued the fight for their old gods and freedom. Widukind represented the latter, but their ranks were steadily thinning. In 783, Charles launched a new large-scale campaign in Saxony. This time he applied a new tactic, the mass resettlement of Saxons from their lands into the inner regions of the Frankish kingdom. Entire tribes were deported and resettled among the Frankish population, where they quickly assimilated. On the freed territories, Franks were settled, creating outposts of Frankish culture and Christianity in the heart of Saxony. Widukind understood that military victory was becoming impossible. The Franks had overwhelming superiority in resources, organization, and armaments. Each campaign weakened the Saxons more and more, destroying their crops, driving away cattle, and razing villages. The continuation of the war led to the complete destruction of the Saxon people. It was necessary to find a way to save at least the lives of his people, even at the cost of abandoning independence. In the autumn of 785, an event occurred that changed the course of the Saxon war. Widukind, Charles's greatest enemy, the one who had led the resistance to the Frankish conquest for more than 10 years, agreed to negotiation. Mediators were those Saxon chieftains who had sided with the Franks. Charles guaranteed Widukind's safety and offered honorable terms of surrender. The meeting between Charles and Widukind took place in Attigny, a Frankish royal residence. The terms offered to the Saxon leader were unexpectedly lenient. Widukind had to accept baptism and acknowledge the supreme authority of Charles over Saxony. In return, he was guaranteed his life, freedom, and the preservation of his estates. Moreover, Charles offered Widukind the chance to become his vassal and ally, to occupy an honorable place among the Frankish nobility. Widukind agreed. The ceremony of his baptism was arranged with the greatest solemnity. Charles himself became the godfather of his former enemy, which according to Germanic customs created sacred bonds between them. Widukind received rich gifts and land holdings. He publicly called on all Saxons to stop the resistance and accept Christianity. The capitulation of their greatest hero made a huge impression on the Saxons and became a turning point in the war. After Widukind's baptism, resistance in Saxony did not cease completely, but it lost its organized character. Individual tribes continued to rebel, but these were already local mutinies that the Frankish state easily suppressed. Charles continued to methodically conquer one region after another, building fortresses, appointing counts from among loyal Saxons or Franks, and establishing bishoprics to manage spiritual life. The process of Christianizing Saxony stretched over many years. Formally, the Saxons accepted baptism, but old beliefs continued to live in secret. Frankish missionaries faced passive resistance from the population, which outwardly observed Christian rites but remained faithful to the old gods in their hearts. It took decades of systematic preaching and education for Christianity to truly take root in Saxon society. By the early 90s of the 8th century, the main territory of Saxony was conquered and integrated into the Frankish state. Charles divided Saxony into counties in the Frankish style, appointed bishops, and built a network of churches and monasteries. The Saxon nobility gradually merged into the Frankish aristocracy, adopting its customs and way of life. The process of cultural assimilation began, which would be completed only after a few generations. However, even in the 90s, peace in Saxony remained fragile. In 793, a new large-scale uprising broke out, covering the northern regions of Saxony. The rebels destroyed Frankish garrisons and announced a return to paganism. Charles had to lead his troops beyond the Rhine again and suppress the rebellion with his former cruelty. Only at the beginning of the 9th century, after more than 30 years of wars, was Saxony finally subdued. The conquest of Saxony was Charles's greatest military achievement, but also his bloodiest. Decades of continuous wars led to enormous casualties on both sides. Entire tribes were destroyed or deported. Saxon pagan culture was almost completely eradicated. In return, The Saxons received Christianity and entry into the European civilizational sphere. For the Frankish state, the annexation of Saxony meant a significant expansion of territory and the strengthening of its eastern border. The Saxon Wars showed both the military genius of Charles and his ruthlessness. He was ready to use any method to achieve his goals, not stopping at mass executions, deportations, and cultural genocide. In his actions, the idea of a holy war for the spread of Christianity manifested itself, where the end justified any means. This idea would become characteristic of European history for many centuries to come. While Charles was fighting in Saxony, a new opportunity for territorial expansion arose in the south of his state. In Spain, which was under the rule of the Moorish Cordoba Emirate, internal turmoil had begun. Muslim Spain was experiencing a period of political instability. Local rulers fought among themselves, and the central authority of the emir was weakened. Some Arab and Berber rulers of border regions sought an alliance with the Franks against their enemy. In 777, the ambassadors of Sulayman al-Arabi, the ruler of Barcelona and Girona, arrived at Charles's court. He offered the king of the Franks an alliance against the Cordoba emir and promised to open the gates of his cities to Frankish troops. For Charles, this was a tempting prospect to expand his possessions beyond the Pyrenees and create a bridgehead for the future conquest of Muslim Spain. He decided to undertake a major military expedition. In the spring of 778, a huge Frankish army set out on a campaign. Charles gathered troops from all ends of his kingdom, including Aquitanians, Burgundians, Provençals, Bavarians, and Lombards. It was one of the largest military expeditions of his reign. The army was divided into two columns. One, under the command of Charles himself, moved through the western Pyrenees. The other, under the guidance of his associates, went by the eastern route through Roussillon. The crossing of the Pyrenees went successfully. Frankish troops entered the territory of Muslim Spain. However, subsequent events did not develop as planned. Sulayman al-Arabi indeed surrendered Barcelona, but in other cities, the Franks met with resistance. The city of Zaragoza, on which Charles had high hopes, refused to open its gate. The siege dragged on, and problems with food and diseases began in the Frankish camp. In the summer, alarming news arrived from Saxony. The Saxons had launched a major uprising, taking advantage of the king's absence. Widukind had returned from exile and headed the rebellion. Frankish garrisons were destroyed, and Christian churches were razed. Charles realized that he needed to return urgently. The Spanish expedition, having failed to achieve its goals, was interrupted. The king gave the order to retreat. The return journey through the Pyrenees became fateful for part of the Frankish army. When the rear guard of the army was passing through the narrow Roncesvalles pass in the Pyrenees, it was suddenly attacked by local Basques. The Basques were Christians but hated the Franks for their attempts to establish control over their lands. They set an ambush in the narrowest part of the gorge, where the Frankish army was most vulnerable. On August 15, 778, the battle occurred that went down in history as the Battle of Roncesvalles. The Basques, occupying the dominant heights, threw stones at the Frankish columns, shot arrows, and carried out surprise attacks, retreating quickly. The Franks, hampered by the narrow space of the gorge, could not deploy their battle order and use their superiority in heavy cavalry. The rear guard was crushed, and the baggage train was plundered. Among the dead were many noble Frankish military leaders. Chronicles name Einhard, the royal seneschal, Anselm, the Count Palatine, and Rudland, the Margrave of the Breton March. The latter subsequently became the hero of the greatest work of medieval French literature, the Song of Roland, where the Battle of Roncesvalles was reinterpreted as a heroic battle against the Saracen. In reality, it was a defeat by the Christian Basques, but the memory of the event was preserved in a transformed form. The Roncesvalles catastrophe was a serious blow to Charles's prestige. The Spanish expedition failed, and the return was marred by the death of many of the best warriors. The king was forced to acknowledge that his plans for the conquest of Muslim Spain were overly ambitious. Henceforth, Frankish policy in Spain would be more cautious and limited. Nevertheless, Barcelona and the surrounding territories remained under Frankish control. In subsequent years, Charles gradually expanded Frankish holdings in northeastern Spain. The so-called Spanish March was created a border region serving as a buffer between the Frankish kingdom and Muslim Spain. The Franks captured Girona, then gradually moved along the coast. The Spanish March was governed by Frankish counts but retained a certain autonomy due to its border position. The local Christian population of northeastern Spain viewed Frankish rule in different ways. Some saw in the Franks protectors from Muslim domination and allies in the cause of the Reconquista. Others perceived them as foreign invaders imposing their own orders. The Basques continued to resist attempts at Frankish control, regularly rising up against the appointed count. The Spanish direction of Frankish expansion never became a priority for Charles. He understood that the conquest of all of Muslim Spain would require too many resources and divert forces from more important tasks. The creation of the Spanish March was sufficient to ensure the security of the kingdom's southern border. Charles's main efforts were directed to the east, where wars with the Saxons continued and new opportunities for conquests. Towards the end of the 8th century, Charles turned his attention to the eastern borders of his state, where the lands of the Avar Khaganate were located. The Avars were a nomadic people of Turkic or Mongolic origin who, in the 6th century, had migrated to Pannonia, a region corresponding to modern Hungary. For 2 centuries, the Avars dominated Central Europe, carrying out devastating raids on neighboring lands and collecting tribute from conquered peoples. The Avar Khaganate was experiencing a period of decline. Internal strife had weakened the central power of the Khagan. Subjugated Slavic tribes had begun to break away from the Khaganate. Bavarian dukes, nominally vassals of Charles, waged constant border wars with the Avars. The Frankish king was reported to have heard of the untold treasures accumulated by the Avars over a century of predatory war. This was a tempting target, capable of significantly replenishing the royal treasury. In 788, the first major Frankish campaign against the Avars began. Charles organized a large-scale offensive from several directions. One army under his personal command moved along the Danube. Another, under the guidance of his son, Pepin of Italy, advanced from the south. A third, under the command of Bavarian counts, attacked from the west. This was a meticulously planned operation intended to surround and destroy Avar forces. The Franks encountered an unusual opponent. The Avars were light cavalry, masters of horseback archery, using tactics of fast raids and avoiding direct confrontation. Their fortified camps, the so-called rings, were concentric circles of earthworks and moats where accumulated wealth was stored. Storming such fortifications was a complex task. The first campaign did not bring a decisive result. The Franks devastated significant territories and seized some booty, but the Khagan remained unconquered. Avar cavalry avoided general battle, wearing down the Franks with constant attacks. Food shortages began, and in the autumn, Charles was forced to withdraw his troops. However, the king did not intend to give up on the conquest of the rich Khaganate. In subsequent years, the Franks methodically destroyed Avar statehood. In 791, an army under the command of Pepin of Italy broke through to the central Avar ring and captured it. The booty proved to be truly enormous. For several weeks, wagons with treasures moved to Charles's residence in Aachen. Contemporaries wrote that the Franks had never seen such a quantity of gold, silver, and precious fabrics before. The seizure of Avar treasures had important economic consequences for the Franks. The massive amount of precious metals allowed Charles to generously reward his loyal vassals, strengthening their loyalty. Part of the treasures was transferred to the church, which reinforced the alliance between royal power and the clergy. The royal treasury was replenished to such an extent that Charles could finance new military undertakings and large-scale construction projects. After the destruction of the central ring, the Avar Khaganate effectively ceased to exist as a single state. Individual Avar chieftains recognized the supreme authority of Charles, accepted Christianity, and became his vassals. Pannonia was divided into marches, border areas under the rule of Frankish count. The Christianization and Francization of the local population began, which included both Avars and the Slavic tribes they had subjugated. The conquest of the Avar Khaganate significantly expanded the borders of the Frankish state to the east. Charles now controlled territories up to the Carpathian. His power extended to areas that for centuries had been outside the European Christian world. This created new opportunities for further expansion, but also new problems. The eastern border became extended and difficult to defend, requiring a constant military presence and large expenses. Successes in the east enhanced Charles's international prestige. By the end of the 8th century, the Frankish king controlled territory comparable to the Western Roman Empire in its prime. His state included modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, most of Germany, Austria, Switzerland, northern Italy, and parts of Spain. Charles was the most powerful ruler in the Christian world. His influence extended from the Atlantic to the Danube. Rulers from distant lands turned to the king of the Franks for help and patronage. The Byzantine emperor, formerly considered the head of the entire Christian world, was forced to recognize the real power of Charles. Even the Caliph of Baghdad, Harun al-Rashid, the ruler of the powerful Abbasid Caliphate, maintained a friendly correspondence with Charles and exchanged embassies. The Frankish king turned into a key figure in the international politics of his time. All these circumstances prepared the ground for an event that would change Charles's title and create a new political reality in Europe. A crisis was brewing that would give the Frankish king the opportunity to claim the highest title that could exist in the Christian world. The year was approaching when Charles would become emperor. At the end of the 8th century, a tense political situation had developed in Rome. Pope Leo III, elected in 795, faced fierce opposition from the Roman nobility. Relatives of the previous pope, Hadrian, accused Leo of various crimes, including adultery and perjury. On April 25, 799, an assassination attempt was made on the Pope during a church procession. The conspirators attacked Leo, attempting to blind him and tear out his tongue, wishing to make him unfit for papal service. However, the Pope managed to escape. He found refuge in a monastery, from where he sent a desperate plea for help to Charles. The Frankish king was the only force capable of protecting the head of the church from his enemies. Charles immediately reacted, sending his representatives to Rome to investigate the circumstances of the case. In the summer of 799, Pope Leo personally arrived in Paderborn, where Charles's court was located. He sought the protection and support of the Frankish king against his Roman enemies. Charles received the Pope with honors, listened to his version of events, and promised to restore him to his throne. This was an unprecedented case where the head of the entire Christian church sought patronage from a secular ruler, which clearly showed the balance of real power. In the autumn of 800, Charles set off for Rome at the head of a significant military contingent. He arrived in the Eternal City at the end of November and immediately began the investigation of the papal case. A council of bishops and Frankish counts considered the accusations against Leo. It was decided that the Pope, as head of the Church, could not be judged by men, but could clear himself by oath. On December 23, Leo III publicly swore his innocence, and the case was closed. 2 days later, on December 25, 800, on the Feast of the Nativity of Christ, an event of the greatest historical significance occurred. Charles was present at a solemn mass in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. When the king knelt before the altar for prayer, Pope Leo III unexpectedly placed the imperial crown on his head. The people present proclaimed 3 times, "To Charles, the most pious Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-loving emperor, many years and victory." Thus, Charles became Emperor of the Romans, the first Western emperor since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. The official justification for the coronation served the fact that the Byzantine throne at that moment was occupied by a woman, Empress Irene, and according to Roman concepts, a woman could not be a legitimate emperor. Consequently, the empire was considered vacant, and the Pope had the right to crown a new emperor. This was a legal fiction, but it gave the coronation the appearance of legitimacy in the eyes of contemporaries. Charles's biographer, Einhard, claimed that the king was caught off guard by the coronation and did not know about the Pope's intention. According to this version, Charles was so displeased that he stated he would not have entered the church if he had known about Leo's plan. However, most historians consider this statement implausible. Such an important event could not have happened without prior agreement between the king and the Pope. Most likely, Einhard wanted to present the matter as if the initiative came from the Pope so as not to irritate the Byzantines. In reality, the coronation was a carefully planned ceremony advantageous to both sides. Pope Leo received a powerful protector whose power was now illuminated by an imperial title. Charles acquired the highest status that could exist in the Christian world. He became not just the king of the Franks and Lombards, but an emperor, heir to the Roman Caesars, and the supreme ruler of the Christian West. The Byzantine Empire categorically refused to recognize the legality of the coronation. The court in Constantinople believed that the imperial title could belong only to the Byzantine basileus, the legitimate heir to the Roman emperor. Charles's coronation was perceived as a usurpation, an illegal seizure of a title belonging exclusively to the rulers of the Eastern Roman Empire. This led to a serious cooling of relations between the Frankish state and Byzantium. The Byzantine fleet carried out several attacks on the Venetian coast and Dalmatian cities, which had recognized Charles's authority. A war began that lasted for several years. However, the Byzantines could not seriously threaten Charles's state, and their forces were tied up in wars with the Arabs and Bulgars in the east. In the end, in 812, a peace treaty was concluded under which Byzantium de facto recognized Charles's imperial title, although it did not call him Emperor of the Romans, using the formula Emperor of the Franks. The adoption of the imperial title had major consequences for Europe. It meant a break with the Byzantine concept of a unified Roman Empire and the creation of an independent Western Empire. It was the birth of a new political reality, where the West and the East of the Christian world finally diverged not only ecclesiastically but also politically. The crown placed on Charles would subsequently become the crown of the Holy Roman Empire, which would exist until 1806. Charles took the imperial title very seriously. He considered himself the protector of the entire Christian world, responsible not only for political management but also for the spiritual well-being of his subjects. The emperor saw his mission in the spread of Christianity, the eradication of heresies, and the protection of the church from enemies. This idea of a Christian emperor, combining the functions of a secular ruler and defender of the faith, would become key to medieval European political thought. After the coronation, Charles remained in Italy for several more months, dealing with administrative matters. He issued several capitularies strengthening imperial power, judged the wrongdoers who had attempted to assassinate the Pope, and received embassies from various rulers. In the spring of 801, the emperor returned to his favorite residence in Aachen, where he would spend most of his remaining year. Aachen became a true capital of the empire, although formally the emperor continued the tradition of the traveling court. A magnificent palace complex was built there with a chapel that has survived to this day. The palace included a throne room where the emperor received ambassadors and administered justice, as well as living quarters and outbuilding. Of particular importance was the Palatine Chapel, an octagonal building inspired by Byzantine architecture. In Aachen, the intellectual center of the empire, the so-called Palatine Academy, was formed. Charles gathered the greatest scholars of his time from all corners of the Christian world at his court. The Anglo-Saxon Alcuin, the Lombard Paul the Deacon, the Visigoth Theodulf, the Irishman Dungal, and many others formed a circle of enlightened men engaged in education, literature, and theology. The emperor himself, although he had not received a systematic education in his youth, was keenly interested in science and patronized scholar. Alcuin became Charles's main advisor on matters of education and church policy. He developed a program for the reform of education designed to raise the intellectual level of the Frankish clergy. Schools were established at monasteries and cathedrals where Latin grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy were taught. Ancient manuscripts were copied, and a new type of script, Carolingian minuscule, was created, which was more convenient for reading. The cultural upsurge of the era of Charles's rule was called the Carolingian Renaissance. This was a period of revived interest in ancient culture, the rebirth of Latin scholarship, and the development of literature and art. Although the scale of this rebirth is incomparable to the Italian Renaissance of later centuries, for its time it was a significant phenomenon. The Carolingian Renaissance laid the foundations for medieval European culture and preserved many ancient texts for posterity. The final years of Charles's reign were marred by personal tragedies and anxieties about the future of the empire. One after another, his sons, on whom he had pinned hopes for managing the vast state, died. In 810, Pepin of Italy, king of Italy, passed away. In 811, his eldest son, Charles the Younger, whom his father had been preparing as his successor, died. Only his youngest son, Louis, king of Aquitaine, remained a man who was pious but did not possess the qualities of a great ruler. At the beginning of the century, the elderly emperor faced a new threat that would plague Europe for the next 2 centuries. On the northern seas appeared the ships of the Vikings, Scandinavian warriors who began to carry out daring raids on the coast of the Frankish Empire. In 810, the Danish fleet attacked Frisia, plundered several coastal settlements, and escaped before Frankish troops could arrive. Charles understood the seriousness of the new threat. He ordered the construction of a fleet to protect the coast, the fortification of river mouths, and the creation of a coastal guard system. Along the northern and western coast, watchtowers and fortresses were erected. However, these measures could only limit the scale of the raids, not stop them completely. The Vikings possessed superior nautical qualities. Their ships could sail up rivers and suddenly appear where they were not expected. On the southern borders of the empire, problems also arose. Arab pirates from North Africa and Muslim Spain began to attack the coasts of Provence and Italy. The islands of the Mediterranean were subjected to regular raids. Corsica and Sardinia, nominally part of the empire, were effectively not controlled by imperial authorities. The Mediterranean, once a Roman internal lake, turned into an arena of constant conflict. In the east, Frankish expansion reached its limit. Beyond the Elbe and in the Danubian lands lived numerous Slavic tribes, which could not be completely conquered. Some of them recognized the supreme authority of the emperor and paid tribute, while others maintained their independence. The Bulgarian Empire, which had arisen in the Balkans, represented a strong state capable of resisting both Byzantium and the Franks. Within the empire, a constant threat of mutinies and conspiracies remained. The Frankish nobility was self-willed and ambitious. Local counts often perceived their positions as hereditary domains and behaved as independent rulers. Charles was forced to constantly control his vassals, suppress attempts at disobedience, and dismiss disloyal counts. Only the strong personality of the emperor and the memory of his former power held the empire from collapsing. In 813, sensing his approaching death, Charles convened a solemn assembly in Aachen to decide the question of succession. His only surviving legitimate son was Louis of Aquitaine. The emperor crowned him as co-emperor and co-ruler, wishing to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. Louis took an oath to his father and received the imperial crown from the hands of the old emperor without the participation of the Pope. This coronation had important political significance. Charles demonstrated that imperial power was passed down by inheritance within his dynasty and did not depend on the will of the Pope. Unlike his own coronation in 800, where the Pope had placed the crown, Charles himself crowned his successor. This was a step toward asserting the secular character of imperial power, independent of church sanction. In the winter of 813-814, Charles's health sharply deteriorated. He was already about 72 years old, a very advanced age for that time. The emperor suffered from a fever, which contemporaries described as pleurisy or pneumonia. Despite his illness, he continued to conduct state affairs, receive reports, and issue orders. Charles remained a ruler until his last day, unable to give up the burden of power. On January 28, 814, on the 7th day after the onset of the illness, the Emperor Charlemagne passed away in Aachen. He was buried that same day in the Palatine Chapel, which he himself had built. According to legend, the emperor's body was interred in a seated position on a throne, in full imperial regalia, with a crown on his head and a scepter in his hand. However, the authenticity of this information causes doubts among historians. The death of Charles caused universal sorrow in the empire. Contemporaries understood that the greatest figure of the era, the man who had changed the face of Europe, had passed away. Chroniclers mourned the passing of the emperor, calling him the father of Europe, the protector of Christianity, a wise ruler, and an invincible warrior. The church praised his piety and concern for the spread of the faith. The common people remembered the years of his rule as a time of relative order and prosperity. Charles's heir, Emperor Louis, who received the nickname the Pious, was a completely different person. Deeply religious and inclined more toward monastic life than to state management, he did not possess the iron will and political talent of his father. Under him, the empire began to gradually fall apart. Centrifugal forces began to gain the upper hand over central authority. The Frankish nobility felt the weakness of the new emperor and began to act ever more independently. Already during Louis's lifetime, disputes arose about the division of the empire between his sons. Frankish tradition demanded the division of possessions among all legitimate heirs, which contradicted the idea of a unified and indivisible empire. After Louis's death in 841, a cruel war broke out between his sons. The brothers fought each other for supreme power, devastating the lands of the empire. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun was concluded, dividing the empire into 3 parts. The eldest brother, Lothair, received the imperial title and the middle part, including Italy and a narrow strip of land from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Louis the German received the eastern part, lands to the east of the Rhine, the future Germany. Charles the Bald became king of the western part, the future France. This was the end of the unified empire of Charlemagne. The division of 843 laid the foundations for the future political map of Europe. The eastern and western parts would eventually turn into Germany and France, the 2 largest states of medieval Europe, whose rivalry would determine European history for centuries to come. The middle part, which went to Lothair, would prove to be the most unstable and would be a constant bone of contention between neighbors. Charles's empire existed as a unified state for only 1 generation after the death of its creator. This shows how much his domain was the personal creation of a great ruler, forged by the strength of his will and talent. Without Charles, there was no power that could hold such diverse territories and peoples together. The empire proved short-lived, but its legacy survived for centuries. Charlemagne was a man of impressive appearance, which made a strong impression on contemporaries. According to the description of his biographer, Einhard, the emperor was distinguished by his tall stature, strong build, round face, and large, expressive eyes. He wore long mustaches, according to Frankish tradition. In his old age, his hair turned gray. Charles's voice was strong and resonant, which helped him lead troops and deliver speeches at assemblies. The emperor led an active lifestyle until his final year. He was a passionate hunter and an excellent horseman, loved swimming, and often bathed in the thermal springs of Aachen, which was what had attracted him to the place. Charles ate and drank moderately by the standards of his time, although he loved roasted meat. He especially could not stand drunkenness and strictly ensured that no one at court abused wine. Charles's personal life was complex and did not always comply with church norms. He was married 4 or 5 times, had numerous concubines, and about 18 children from different marriages and liaisons. The first marriage, with the Lombard princess, was annulled after a year. The second wife, Hildegard, from a noble Alemannic family, bore him 9 children but died young. The third wife, Fastrada, was a Frank, and the fourth, Lutgard, was an Alemannian. The emperor tenderly loved his daughters and did not want to marry them off, preferring to keep them at court. This strange behavior caused gossip. Some wagged tongues about unnatural relationships. It is more likely that Charles simply did not want to create powerful sons-in-law who could lay claim to power, and he feared being parted from his daughter. However, the emperor's daughters led a rather free lifestyle and had illegitimate children. Intellectually, Charles was a curious man. Although he had not received a systematic education, he spoke the Frankish dialect, understood Latin perfectly, and could express himself in it, although with difficulty. The emperor was interested in astronomy and enjoyed listening to books being read during meals. He especially loved The City of God by St. Augustine. He tried to learn to write, keeping wax tablets under his pillow for practice, but he had started too late and did not achieve great success. Charles was a deeply religious man who sincerely believed in his divine destiny. He regularly attended church services, generously donated to the construction of temples and monasteries, and patronized the clergy. The emperor saw himself as a protector of Christianity, responsible for the spiritual well-being of his subjects. At the same time, he was not a hypocrite and knew how to enjoy earthly pleasure. As a ruler, Charles was demanding, decisive, and often cruel, but fair by the standards of his time. He personally delved into all important state affairs, toured his domains, received complaints, and presided over judicial cases. The emperor created a system of royal envoys, missi dominici, who inspected counties, monitored local rulers, and accepted appeals against their decision. This system helped maintain the unity of a huge state. Charles issued many laws, or capitularies, regulating all aspects of society. These documents concerned military affairs, judicial proceedings, economics, church matters, and education. The emperor strove to create a uniform legal system throughout the empire. Albeit with allowances for local tradition, he patronized trade, cared for the maintenance of roads and bridges, and tried to manage a unified monetary system. Charles's military talent is undeniable. In 46 years of rule, he conducted more than 50 military campaigns, expanding his possessions twofold compared to his father's inheritance. The emperor personally participated in most of the important campaigns, setting an example of bravery for his warriors. He knew how to organize complex operations, coordinate the actions of several armies, and use diplomacy to weaken an enemy. Charles created a military machine that had no equal in Europe of his time. However, Charles's methods were often extremely cruel. Mass executions, deportations of entire peoples, forced Christianization, the destruction of enemy temples and shrines, all this was part of his policy. The emperor knew no doubt or pity when it came to achieving his goal. For him, the goal of spreading Christianity and expanding his power justified any means. This ruthlessness was typical for the era, but even against that background, Charles stood out. The cultural legacy of Charles's reign is enormous. The Carolingian Renaissance saved for European civilization a multitude of ancient texts that could have been irrevocably lost. The education reform carried out under Charles laid the foundations for the medieval school system. The Carolingian minuscule, developed in the scriptoria of his empire, formed the basis for modern Latin font. The architecture of the Carolingian era influenced the subsequent development of European architecture. The political legacy of Charles is no less significant. He created the concept of a Christian empire uniting the peoples of Western Europe under his power. This idea outlived the collapse of his state and was embodied in the Holy Roman Empire, which existed for 1,000 years. The imperial crown placed on Charles in 800 would become the highest symbol of power in medieval Europe. The struggle for the possession of this crown would determine European politics for centuries. Charles became the hero of countless legends and literary work. Medieval epics, primarily the Song of Roland, transformed him into an ideal Christian ruler, a fighter against the infidels, a wise and just king. The real historical Charles, a cruel conqueror and a merciless ruler, was transformed in folk memory into the image of a hero. In France, he was called Charlemagne. In Germany, Karl der Grosse. Everywhere in Europe, his name became a symbol of a glorious past. The Church hesitated for a long time regarding the canonization of Charles because of his not entirely exemplary personal life. However, on the 29th of December 1165, at the insistence of Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa, the anti-pope Paschal III canonized him in Aachen. This canonization was not recognized by official Rome, but Charles was venerated as a saint in some regions, especially in Aachen, where his remains were kept. His feast day was celebrated on January 28. The significance of Charlemagne for European history cannot be overestimated. He was the creator of medieval Europe, a man whose conquests and reforms determined the development of the continent for centuries to come. Under his rule, most of Western Europe was united for the first time since the fall of Rome. He laid the foundations for the feudal system, the union of secular power and the Church, and the idea of a Christian empire. Without Charles, Europe would have been completely different. Charles's empire collapsed soon after his death, but the civilizational community he created survived for centuries. The peoples united by his conquests preserved a common Christian culture, Latin writing, and Roman Germanic legal traditions. From the ruins of his empire, modern European nations were born: the French, the Germans, the Italians. Charlemagne was the father of Europe not only for his contemporaries but for all subsequent generations up to the present day. More than 1,200 years have passed since the death of Charlemagne, but his name continues to live on. Historians debate his legacy, politicians appeal to his example, and ordinary people remember the legends of the great emperor. Charles remains one of the key figures in European history, a man who changed the world. His life was full of wars and cruelty, but also of greatness and achievement. Charlemagne was the true creator of the European civilization we know today.